She didn't scream. She didn't confront him. She didn't even try. Not where anyone could see her. She simply got dressed, called her lawyer, and showed up to his party for his mistress in his building, or so he thought. 7 months pregnant, standing under $18,000 worth of flowers her husband bought for another woman, Margot didn't look like a woman whose world was falling apart. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Because here's what Derek never knew. The woman he dismissed, the wife he called ordinary, the mother he left at home while he celebrated someone else's birthday, she quietly owned a 43% stake in the very rooftop he rented. He thought he married beneath him. He had no idea who he was standing across from. This story will remind you that the person everyone underestimates is almost always the one holding all the cards. Stay for what happens when she finally decides to play them. If this hits close to home, drop a comment below. We read every single one, and if you know someone who's been shrinking themselves to fit into someone else's world, share this with them. Subscribe because every week we bring you a story that stays with you long after it ends.
After placing Derek's phone back on the counter, she picked up her own and dialed a number she knew by heart. 2 rings, then a man's voice. "Russell," she'd said, her voice steady, "I need you to pull the prenuptial asset schedule, and I want the full picture on the Ellison Trust disbursement calendar." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Should I ask why?" he finally asked. "Not yet," she replied, "but soon." She hung up, a hand pressed flat against her stomach, feeling the baby kick. A silent promise passed between them. Before that call, there was the silence. After Derek left for the office, kissing the top of her head like a man kissing a stranger, the kitchen hummed with the sound of the refrigerator. He hadn't mentioned Saturday. She'd sat perfectly still, closing her laptop. She listened to the distant rumble of a garbage truck, letting the ordinary sounds ground her. She had already washed the single spoon she'd used and placed it in the drying rack. That is what you do when your world is falling apart. You wash the spoon, you put it away, you breathe. She had stood there, barefoot and eating strawberry yogurt, deciding if her marriage was over. Her character, her father always said, should be the loudest thing in the room. Right then, her character was very, very quiet. Just an hour earlier, that quiet had been a storm. For 11 minutes, she stood at the kitchen island, scrolling through 14 months of a parallel life her husband was living. It wasn't just the affair. It was the tenderness, the nicknames, the inside jokes, the photos from restaurants she had wanted to try, places he was always too tired for. Then she saw the most recent texts about the party, the private buyout of the Rosewood rooftop, the Krug, the 50 guests. "You only turn 30 once," he had written to the other woman. "You deserve the world." Margot's brain went still and fast, like a computer processing a file it was never meant to open. She took no screenshots. She simply set the phone back down, exactly as she had found it. And how did it all start? Not with a fight or a lipstick-stained collar. It started with music. A Spotify playlist titled Cass Summer, drifting from a phone left face up on the counter. There were 47 songs on it. Margot recognized 3 of them immediately. They were the very songs Derek had always claimed to hate, dismissing them whenever she played them. It was a small detail, a tiny crack in the facade, but it was enough. The wrongness of it settled in her stomach, a cold counterpoint to the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the window. It was a Tuesday in late August. Margot, 7 months pregnant, was standing barefoot in her kitchen. One hand rested on the small of her back, the other on a glass of water she hadn't touched. The morning light, which usually made her feel hopeful, now just seemed to wash everything out, making it all feel overexposed and fake. She reached for the phone, thinking it was hers. It wasn't. The screen was unlocked, Derek never bothered with passcodes around her, a detail she once saw as trust, but now understood as arrogance. A text preview flashed on the screen. Can't wait Saturday. That was the thread that unraveled everything. But as she scrolled through the messages, she discovered something more than just an affair. She found the reservation for the rooftop party and the address of the building, and that's when another, much larger secret came into focus. A secret she had kept from Derek since the day they met. She hadn't told him the full truth about who she was, about her family, about their money. She had her reasons, or so she thought. But standing there, with a clean spoon in the drying rack and a betrayal in her hands, she realized the secret she'd kept to protect herself was now the very thing that would save her. She called her best friend, Patrice, who knew instantly that something was catastrophically wrong. As she sat at Patrice's kitchen table, recounting the playlist and the texts, Margot didn't cry. She was functional. She wanted to say she'd always known something was off, a low hum of wrongness beneath the surface of their marriage. She'd just never wanted to be the kind of woman who looked for it. But now she had proof, and Patrice, listening with a clenched jaw, was ready for war. What Patrice didn't know, what no one but Margot's family knew, was the full extent of the Ellison money. And that the rooftop Derek had so lavishly booked to celebrate his mistress was on a building that Margot, his quiet, underestimated wife, could buy and sell before breakfast. It was enough to see that Margot's upbringing had been different. A family compound in Connecticut was part of it. Her dad, Theo Ellison, came from what Patrice called, in her more delicate moments, substantial old money. Margot's car was unassuming, her clothes were ordinary, and she worked as an art acquisitions consultant not from necessity, but from pure passion. This was a different type of affluence, one that never felt the need to be loud. What Patrice couldn't grasp was its sheer scale, the complete story, or why Russell Hart, a man with 3 law degrees managing a global portfolio, would take Margot's call before 8 a.m. What Margot left unsaid at Patrice's kitchen table was that Ellison Holdings had an estimated worth of $2.3 billion, that the trust her father set up before his death 4 years prior gave her control of 41% of it, and that the prenuptial agreement Derek signed after a 40-minute review with a lawyer from a referral site had clauses he'd clearly glossed over. She kept all this to herself because Vivian Ellison had taught her one simple rule about wealth. It's not a weapon until someone makes you use it. And Derek had just done that. Patrice asked softly how long she suspected it had been going on. The messages go back 14 months, Margot said. A quick, painful calculation. 14 months ago, she and Derek were just back from celebrating their 2nd anniversary in Portugal. She remembered a faint sunburn on her shoulders and a blue tile he'd bought her from a Lisbon market. That tile was still hanging in their hall. Margot, Patrice said, with care, when did you learn you were pregnant? 13 months ago. Patrice's expression shifted, a carefully managed storm of emotions. So he was already... Yes, Margot confirmed. When I told him about the baby, he was already with her. He held me while I sobbed, scared out of my mind. He promised we'd handle it together. He told me he was the luckiest guy alive. And he was already with her. The silence that filled Patrice's kitchen felt heavy. The refrigerator's drone, a bird hitting a window outside, the mundane sounds of a Tuesday morning that was anything but. Finally, Patrice spoke. Honey, I've been holding my tongue for so long. Margot glanced up. There were signs, small ones. I kept telling myself I was mistaken, just projecting, that Derek just had this kind of... Patrice struggled for the right word. This vibe, What signs? Margot asked. The way he dismissed your job like it was some cute little hobby. How he'd talk right over you at dinner. The remarks about the house, the car, how he always acted so shocked when you knew something he didn't. I thought he just saw me as humble, Margot admitted. No, Patrice said gently. He saw you as less than him. There's a world of difference. That hit Margot in a way she hadn't anticipated. She let the thought settle, turning it over. He never suspected she was hiding a fortune. He just assumed there was nothing to hide. After a moment, Patrice asked the one question Margot was anticipating. What's your next move? Margot was silent for a while, studying her coffee, her hands, then her friend. I'm going to the party, she announced. Patrice just stared. Saturday, Margot continued, the Rosewood rooftop, 50 people, Krug champagne, a full tasting menu, all for a woman named Cassandra turning 30. Margot. He has no idea that I know, Margot said, and I'd prefer to maintain that for one more week. Why? Margot lifted her coffee cup. It was cold, but she drank it anyway. Because, she said, some discussions are best had in front of an audience. Before leaving, she asked Patrice for one last thing, her hand on the doorframe as the August humidity seeped in. Can I borrow that black dress? The one with the empire waist? Patrice gave her a long look. The Giovanni? Yes, Margot said. That dress cost. I know exactly what it cost, Margot cut in. I'm the one who convinced you to get it. The 22-minute drive from Patrice's was spent doing the very thing she'd trained herself for years not to do. She remembered. Specifically, the first time Derek met her mother. Vivian Ellison had hosted them at the Connecticut estate, not in the main residence, but in what she called the garden house, an 11-room cottage on the property. Vivian served tea, acted perfectly cordial, and strolled with Derek through the rose garden, asking polite questions about his career, his background, his plans. Later, while Derek was using the restroom, Vivian turned to Margot. He has no clue, does he? It wasn't really a question. No, Margot replied. When will you tell him? When I'm sure he loves me for who I am. Vivian studied her daughter with that specific gaze, the one that saw everything but only judged a fraction of it. That isn't wisdom, Margot, she said at last. That's fear. And you know the difference. Yes, Margot said. I do. She always planned to tell him. There was a whole strategy. Wait until after the first year, after they'd built a real foundation, after she was completely certain. But 1 year bled into 2, which led to a wedding, which came with a prenup Russell drafted with such precision that Margot hardly had to spare it a thought. By that point, the secret wasn't a secret anymore. It was the very framework of her life, a supporting wall she couldn't tear down without bringing the whole house with it. She never actively deceived Derek about who she was. She just omitted the full story. Was that so wrong? I've wrestled with that question for 3 years and still don't have a clear answer. Every person I've met who knew about the money first always saw me differently. They looked at me like I was a goal, a fix for a problem they were trying to solve. Derek just looked at me like I was a person, a normal, sometimes stubborn, often difficult person. I craved that. I needed to be someone's person before I became someone's golden ticket. But now I have to wonder if I just created a man who believed he married beneath him, a man who saw himself as the sole provider, whose wife was utterly dependent on him, who thought she cut the thought short. She was parked in the driveway of their shared home and had been for 6 minutes. The garage door was open, revealing the dusty corner with Derek's golf clubs and a shelf of half-empty paint cans from the remodel 2 years back. She'd funded that remodel. He'd picked the fixtures. It felt equitable, At the time, she went inside. Derek wouldn't be back until 7, giving her plenty of time. She went to her home office, the space Derek called her art room, with the same patronizing affection one might use for a child's playroom. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and video called Russell. Russell Hart materialized on her screen, sitting in his office on the 38th floor of a midtown Manhattan skyscraper. The room was a tasteful compromise between a library and a law firm, floor-to-ceiling bookcases, a mahogany desk inherited from his mentor, and 2 chairs that, in all the years Margot had known him, had never seated anyone but Russell. He was 62 but looked 55 and had served as the Ellison family's chief legal counsel for 23 years. He knew Theo even before Margot was born, and sometimes he spoke to her as if he were seeing her father in miniature, a resemblance he found both reassuring and concerning. "Walk me through what happened," he said. So she did. He listened with the emotional composure of polished marble, showing no reaction. When she was done, he simply asked, "How far along are you?" 31 weeks. And the prenup? "I need to know precisely what he can claim," Margot stated. "In case of—" "I know what case," Russell interrupted, turning to a thick file on his desk that she guessed he kept current. "The simple version," he said, "is not much. Your father was incredibly meticulous. The trust is classified as a separate property asset. Your premarital assets are entirely shielded. The marital estate, what you've acquired together, is subject to equitable distribution. The Rosewood rooftop belonged to a hospitality group in which the Ellison Trust held a 43% stake, a fact Margot was keenly aware of. So when Derek's party reservation was made in a building her family partially owned, she didn't cancel it. She attended. And as he stood there, speechless, she finally saw him understand exactly what he had. It was all she wanted, for him to see her, really see her, one last time before it was all over. Her victory wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet, calculated outcome, the kind her lawyer, Russell, specialized in. And the plan for it had started just 1 week before. "What would you like to do?" Russell had asked then, his voice calm. "I need 1 week," she had replied, "for the party." He threw a rooftop party for his mistress while his pregnant wife was at home. I refused to let that pass quietly. A long silence stretched as Russell calculated. "Should I be worried?" he asked. "No," Margot said, her eyes drifting to the Diebenkorn painting on her art room wall. "I just want him to understand." Russell considered this. "Should I arrange anything?" "Yes," she'd said. "Make everything public-facing about Ellison Holdings easy to find. Press releases, the Forbes piece, the board announcement, everything." "Why?" "Because he's going to Google me," Margot answered softly, "and I want him to find something." It was then that Russell, in his signature, understated way, revealed the earthquake. "Margot," he said, "are you aware that Derek's party venue is in a building your family trust has a massive stake in?" The question hung in the air. She didn't want to cancel it. She wanted to attend. The days that followed were a masterclass in performance. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Margot played the part of a wife with flawless technique but zero emotion. She cooked a fragrant pasta sauce on Wednesday that Derek devoured, his attention barely present. On Thursday, she asked him pointed questions about his work, feeling the exhaustion of someone who had faked ease for so long they'd forgotten how it truly felt. Then came Friday morning's 31-week prenatal appointment. Dr. Caroline Merritt, a calm and precise woman, made medical facts feel like a conversation. As the cold ultrasound transducer glided over her stomach, the screen showed a perfect, healthy baby. The heart rate was strong, the position was good. Lying there, watching her daughter's heartbeat, Margot felt something that wasn't grief or hope, but a third, unnamed emotion taking root. She went home and relayed the good news to Derek. "Great, great," he said, his eyes glued to his phone. He had helped choose their daughter's name, Eleanor, 2 months ago, then never mentioned it again, as if it were a task checked off a list, not a person about to arrive. But this cold resolve was born from a searing grief that had peaked on Thursday night. Derek had come home late from work drinks, smelling of expensive whiskey and an unfamiliar restaurant. She was in bed, pretending to be asleep, a skill that had become unnervingly easy. After his breathing evened out beside her, she lay in the darkness, not with anger, but with a profound sadness for the marriage she thought she had, for the man she thought she loved, and for all the ways she had made herself smaller for him. Unable to stay still, she had gotten out of bed. The house was quiet, but she was a storm of manic energy. She cleaned the entire main floor, wiping counters, reorganizing the pantry, scrubbing kitchen grout with a toothbrush at 11 p.m., 7 months pregnant. It was unreasonable, but she couldn't stop. When there was nothing left to clean, she drew a bath and just sat on the edge, her feet in the warm water, still in her jeans and sweatshirt. The pale green bathroom tiles she had so carefully chosen stared back at her. "I am going to miss these tiles," she thought, and that's what finally broke her. It wasn't the party or the 14 months of texts or the 47-song playlist. It was the tiles. The pale green tiles she had picked with such love for a house she'd built with a person she'd believed in. She cried for everything the tiles stood for, quietly and efficiently, a skill learned in boarding school. Then she dried her eyes. Before that breakdown, however, there was research. On Wednesday afternoon, she had looked up Cassandra Whitmore through channels that left no digital trace, a skill Russell had taught her. She was 29, a marketing director from Columbus, Ohio. Her Instagram was tasteful, showing a happy person with a loving family. Margot had wanted her to be a caricature, a simple villain. Instead, she was a real person, which made the betrayal feel infinitely worse. She didn't hate Cassandra. She hated that Derek had forced her to even think about this woman. And her search for Cassandra had only happened because of one single moment, the moment that started it all, when she saw the truth with her own eyes. "I'm not crazy," she had told herself then. "I know what I saw, and I know the difference between a man who is a friend and a man who is not." At her kitchen table, bathed in morning sunlight, she finally felt seen. Not vindicated, but accurately represented by a journalist who had clearly done the work. The Forbes article wasn't about her, not directly, but about Ellison Holdings and its new philanthropic venture, a center for women entrepreneurs, at her alma mater, Whitmore College. The 6-page feature identified her as the architect of the foundation's new focus and, more importantly, the controlling trustee. In the accompanying photo, she stood with her mother and 3-week-old Eleanor, who was sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the moment. With her daughter resting in a bassinet nearby, Margot sipped her coffee. She drank the entire cup while it was still hot, a small, simple act that felt like a monumental victory, the first of many to come. His face, a mask of astonished delight, was a masterpiece of improvisation. "Margot," Derek began, "what on earth are you doing here?" She held his gaze. "I was invited," she stated calmly. He sputtered something about it being a public hotel, but her eyes, sweeping across the private rooftop party, told him she knew better. It took him a moment to spot her. He froze, A man watching two separate universes collide in real time. His mind raced, calculating odds, assessing damage, trying to figure out how much she knew. She had to give him credit. He didn't hesitate. He started walking toward her immediately, composing his expression with every step. All this, she knew, began 30 seconds earlier when Graham Whitfield, after a brief, panicked exchange with her, had leaned in and whispered a quiet warning to Derek. The whole thing registered on Graham Whitfield's face in stages. First confusion, then a flash of recognition, and finally, the pure dawning horror of a man realizing he's standing at ground zero. He saw her first. Excusing himself from Derek, he navigated the crowd and approached her. "Margot," he said, his voice strained, as if speaking a foreign language. "I had no idea you were coming." She smiled pleasantly. "It's a beautiful party, Graham." He agreed, then faltered. "Margot, I think maybe—" She cut him off with a question. "Is there somewhere else you think I should be?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Seeing Derek cross the rooftop to kiss Cassandra's cheek and place a hand on her back, Margot instinctively touched her own stomach. Inside, the baby delivered a firm, steady kick, a reminder that she wasn't alone. The moment Cassandra Whitmore entered, the entire party reoriented itself around her, the way a room always does for its guest of honor. She was laughing, radiant in a stunning red dress. When Derek turned, the look on his face was one Margot would analyze for years. It wasn't simple lust. It was a look of profound relief, the expression of someone who has been holding their breath and can finally, deeply exhale. He looked at Cassandra the way you look at something you've decided is worth any price. For 2 minutes, Margot had watched him unseen, absorbing the painful truth. He wasn't free from the stress of work or a baby on the way. He was free from her. In his world, she had become the obligation, and this other woman was the reward. She was the weight he carried, and Cassandra was his rest. She found her spot near the northern edge, where the view of the skyline was perfect, and she could see the entire rooftop without turning her head. The bartender, a young man who looked from her face to her belly and back again, had silently served her sparkling water in a champagne flute. From a distance, it appeared she was part of the celebration. She waited for exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then she saw him. Derek was by the enormous floral arrangement, chatting with his business partner, Graham Whitfield. He was wearing an expensive new suit, one she'd never seen before, and he looked lighter than he had in months. It was the carefree look of a man who had finally set down a heavy burden. And in that instant, she understood with chilling clarity that she was that burden. She walked in as if she belonged there because, in more ways than one, she did. Russell had arranged her access with a single call. As a longtime member of the Rosewoods Private Club and a name on the building's ownership papers, his influence was quiet but absolute. "Don't look for him first," he had instructed. "Let him find you." The rooftop was exquisite, draped in string lights under an amber and violet sky. White linen tables circled a dance floor, and the air smelled of jasmine. Against one wall was a cascade of white flowers, an installation she, an art procurer, estimated at $18,000. 50 guests milled about in cocktail attire when she arrived. She was not on the list, but she didn't need to be. "I'd like you to be there, Mom," Margot had said, over the phone. "Not to do anything. I just don't want to be alone when it happens." A long, complicated silence passed between them, filled with a mother's fierce love. "Tell me what time," Vivian said finally, "and what I should wear." That Saturday morning, at 8:17, Margot stood before the mirror. The black Chanel dress, An Empire waist piece Patrice had recommended fit her 7-month pregnancy perfectly. She pulled her hair back and studied her reflection. Then she texted Russell, "We're ready." His reply came in 3 seconds. "Car is arranged. I'll be there," followed by, "Your father would be very proud." She put down the phone and looked at her reflection. "Let's go," she said. The lie was so polished, he didn't even notice himself performing it anymore. "Oh, I've got a client thing Saturday night," he mentioned casually, not making eye contact as he refilled a glass of water. "Big event, all business. You should have Patrice over, do something relaxing." He looked relieved when she smiled and said, "Of course, have a good time." He had no idea what he was walking into. The next day, she called her mother. Vivian Ellison listened to the entire story without a single interruption. "I see," was all she said when Margot finished. "That's all?" Margot asked. "Your father would be furious," Vivian said after a pause. "But he'd also say that anger is energy, and energy needs to be directed, not wasted." "I'm directing it," Margot confirmed. "I know," her mother replied. "That's why I'm not worried." Under the glow of string lights and surrounded by $18,000 worth of jasmine, she knew. A faint tension in his jaw gave it all away, a tiny signal she'd learned to decipher over 3 years. It was the tell that always came before a carefully constructed lie. "A colleague," he said. "I mentioned it was a work thing." She smiled pleasantly. "You said it was a client event." "Right, that's it." She held the quiet that followed, another skill she'd mastered. Letting the silence do the work. "Derek," she said, her voice steady as a rock, "what is the client's name?" Nothing. In the 3 seconds that hung between them, as champagne flowed and 50 people mingled just 15 feet away, a perfect crystalline calm washed over her. There was no anger, no sadness. For the first time in years, she felt utterly clear. He grabbed her arm, his grip gentle but absolute, guiding her away from the party toward the elevators. The act was gone. This was his real face. Frightened, calculating, and beneath it all, a sliver of what looked like relief. The inevitable confrontation had arrived. "I can explain," he began. "You don't have to," she said. "Margot, I found your phone. Tuesday morning. I saw the texts." The elevator vestibule was silent, the hum of the car a distant presence. The party felt miles away, its music muffled and faint. "I know about Cassandra," she stated. "I know it's been 14 months, and I know you told her she deserved the world." She let that hang in the air. "Our daughter is 7 months along, Derek. You promised her the world while I was at home carrying your child." He had the decency to look as if she'd struck him, the color draining from his face. "Margot, I'm sorry. It's complicated. It just got... I know it got complicated," she cut in. "Everything does. That's a fact of life, not an excuse." "I love you," he pleaded. "I do. This isn't..." "Don't," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Please, just don't." He fell silent. "We will talk," she informed him. "Properly. Not here. My attorney will be in touch with yours on Monday. Until then, I need you to not come home tonight." He just stared. "I'm going back to the party," she said. "To... Margot. Why?" She looked at the man she'd married, at his unfamiliar tie, the suit she hadn't seen, the look of someone who still didn't grasp what he'd lost. "Because I'm not the one with a reason to leave." With that, she walked back to the rooftop. She got a sparkling water from the same bartender who'd offered champagne, found a small table overlooking the city, and sat down. She was 7 months pregnant at her husband's mistress's birthday party, and a strange calm settled over her, the kind of quiet that always precedes a storm. But what no one knew was that she'd already weathered it. She had cried on the way up, not in front of him. Not for the guests, or Graham, or the kind bartender. In the elevator, for the 43 seconds it took to reach the rooftop, she'd pressed her back to the mirrored wall and let out the silent, complete sobs she'd perfected at boarding school. Then the doors opened, and she simply stopped. It was a skill she was exceptionally good at. Derek never returned to the party. Graham told her this about 20 minutes later, approaching her table with the nervous energy of a bomb squad technician. He sat with a much-needed whiskey. "Margot," he started, abandoning some pre-rehearsed speech, "I want you to know I had no idea about any of this for a very long time." "But you found out eventually," she said. A beat of silence passed as he weighed his options. "Yes," he finally admitted. "And you didn't tell me." "No." She met his gaze. "Graham, I'm not mad at you. I get the position you were in. I just need you to know that I know." He nodded, looking utterly miserable and simultaneously grateful to be managed. "Is there anything—" he started. "No," she said. "Enjoy your evening." He retreated. She sat alone for the next 35 minutes. Vivian was on her way. A text confirmed she was in the lobby. So Margot waited, surrounded by jasmine and string lights, the city glittering below. That's when Cassandra noticed her. She wouldn't learn this until later, but while she sat there, Cassandra Whitmore, 29, was asking questions about Derek's sudden exit and the pregnant woman Graham had been confessing to in the corner. Graham, having the worst night of his career, told her just enough. And for the rest of her 30th birthday, Cassandra wore the expression of someone realizing her fairy tale had an entirely different ending. A small, ugly part of Margot was almost sorry for her. Almost. Then Vivian arrived. Margot's mother materialized at the entrance at 9:15. Her slight tardiness suggesting a tactical stop for better shoes or a drink. At 62, Vivian Ellison didn't announce her presence. She simply became the room's center of gravity. She walked straight to Margot's table and sat. "You okay?" she asked. "No." It was the first time Margot had said it out loud. Vivian placed her hand over her daughter's. She offered no advice, no analysis, just held her hand and let the silence be. Sometimes, that is the only thing that works. They sat that way for a long time as the party buzzed around them. At 10:30, Margot said, "I want to go home." "Yes," Vivian replied. "I want to go home, sleep, and just take this one day at a time." "Yes," Vivian said again. "That's exactly right." Margot drove herself, waving off the car service. She needed those 22 minutes of solitude, the city blurring past her windows, the radio playing on a station she never listened to. She arrived home at 11, but couldn't bring herself to enter the bedroom. The sight of Derek's side of the bed was too much. Instead, she went to the nursery. It was the one room she'd poured her heart into, with its perfect, soft white walls and waiting crib. She sank into the glider in the corner, where the morning light would fall just right, and placed her hands on her stomach. At 3 in the morning, she thought, this isn't how it was supposed to be. The picture she'd had of the three of them in this room was gone, and she was left in the dark, trying to imagine the next one. She'd made herself smaller for him, wanting to be chosen for who she was, only to hide so much of herself that he chose a version that didn't truly exist. He chose a woman who needed him, but she had only ever wanted him. It was a crucial difference. She felt a slow, gentle movement from the baby, not the sharp kick from earlier, but something that felt like an answer in the 3 a.m. darkness. I'm here. We're in this together. She stayed there until dawn, then made coffee. On Sunday morning, a text came from Derek. "I need to talk to you, please." She typed back 4 words. "Monday, through our attorneys." Then she put the phone in a drawer and went to water her 17 plants. She tended to each plant, counting them one by one. The task took 40 minutes, each plant a bead on a rosary, just as her grandmother had done. Not for faith, but for the steadying rhythm of a meticulous, simple act. That Monday morning, at 10 a.m., Russell Hart phoned Derek's lawyer, a man named Philip Crane. Crane was capable, if unremarkable, Russell, in the calm, measured voice of someone who'd already won this fight countless times, laid out the facts. Margot Reeve, formerly Ellison, was ready to dissolve the marriage. The prenup was ironclad. Derek's expected share of the estate was a gross miscalculation, as most assets came from a separate property trust. And if he decided to contest it, documents revealing the Ellison family's private holdings would become public record. 45 minutes later, Philip Crane called back. Derek, he said, had some questions. "What exactly did you tell him about Ellison Holdings?" Margot had asked Russell on the phone. "I explained it was a private family trust," he replied, "and that he might have benefited from reading the prenup more closely." Margot paused. How did he react? His lawyer said, and I'm quoting, "My client needs 24 hours. He can have 24 hours, Margot replied, and ended the call. She sat in her art room, noticing how the September light, cooler and softer than August's, signaled summer's retreat. At 2:15 that afternoon, her phone had buzzed with an unknown number. A small, irrational superstition about missed calls, one she'd carried for 31 years, made her pick up. "Margot?" The voice was cautious, raspy, as if from a lack of sleep. "This is it. This is Cassandra Whitmore. I got your number?" "It's not important how. I'm sorry. I can hang up." For a long moment, Margot just sat there, the sound of Cassandra Whitmore's voice hanging in the air. "Don't hang up," she said at last. After a beat, Cassandra spoke. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. That's the only reason I'm calling. I know it might not change anything, but I needed you to hear it from me." "Okay," Margot said. "He told me your marriage was finished," Cassandra explained. "That you had decided to separate and were just working out the details. That was his story from the start. That was what—" Her voice cracked. "What I chose to believe." Margot stayed silent. "I know how that must sound, like the excuse every other woman gives," Cassandra went on, her tone strained. "I know, but I need you to know I would never— if I knew you were pregnant, if I knew about the baby." Her voice shattered completely. "I am so, so sorry." And Margot believed her. She hated that she did, because not believing would be simpler, but she could distinguish a performance from a true reckoning. This was a reckoning. She wasn't calling to make excuses. She was calling after being awake since Saturday night, coming to terms with the fact the man she loved was the same man who would lie to her just as he lied to me. The same person had fooled them both. It didn't make them friends, but it connected them. "Cassandra," Margot said deliberately, "did he ever discuss his finances with you? What he owns? His income?" A brief silence. "He mentioned his real estate deals. He said once his wife had family money, that it helped with the house." Margot took that in. "Did he ever say the family's name?" "No," Cassandra replied. "He really didn't tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Nothing," Margot said. "Nothing that matters at the moment. Cassandra, thank you for making this call. I truly mean it." "Is there anything I can do?" Cassandra offered. "Actually," Margot said, an idea forming, "there might be." The moment she hung up, she dialed Patrice, sitting in her art room before the Diebenkorn, where the afternoon sun made the colors pulse with life. Her father had adored that painting, once standing before it in silence for 20 minutes, the most stillness she had ever witnessed in him. She relayed the conversation with Cassandra to Patrice, who was quiet for so long, Margot thought the call had disconnected. "You're not about to play the martyr. Forgive him and just take all the pain, are you?" Patrice finally asked. "No," Margot stated. "I'm finished taking it." "Good. What's the plan?" "I'm going to make sure Derek understands precisely what he's lost," she said. "And I'm going to make sure the world understands it too." She spoke the words aloud in her quiet art room, not to anyone, but into the space around her, knowing some truths must be voiced to become tangible. At some point, I shrank myself to make someone else feel tall. I am done being small. On Tuesday afternoon at 3, Derek arrived at the house. He'd called ahead. He had at least that much decency left, asking to speak with her alone, without lawyers. She agreed because it was essential that he grasp the entire situation. It wasn't about cruelty or revenge. It was about him finally knowing the full measure of what he had squandered. He looked awful, a product of 2 nights in a hotel and, presumably, a difficult conversation with Cassandra. That, plus the call from Russell, had clearly shattered his worldview. He looked like a man whose frantic calculations kept leading to the same disastrous result. He sat at the kitchen table, and she took the seat opposite him. "Tell me what you want," he said, using a placating tone she'd never heard from him before, a tone that confirmed he already knew the math was bad. "First, I need you to understand something," she began, "before we discuss what I want. Okay?" She took a breath. "When we first met," she said, "I was running an experiment. I wanted to see if someone could love me, for me, apart from my background. That matters to me. It always has. My father left me in a position where I will never have to think about money. I've never known that worry, yet my entire adult life has been a search for someone who would love me without knowing that." Derek sat perfectly still. "You passed the test?" she told him softly. "For a time, Margot." "I'm not done," she cut in. He fell silent. "You passed? But then you stopped seeing me. The person. I became part of the scenery, and while I was becoming a piece of furniture in my own house, you found someone else who saw you as extraordinary. I can even understand that, but what you did, throwing a lavish, expensive party while I was 7 months pregnant at home, that's not a mistake. That is a choice you remade every day for 14 months. He offered no defense. The man who had spent 3 years deflecting, minimizing, and calling her paranoid didn't even try. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you know who owns the building with that rooftop bar?" she asked. He blinked. "The Rosewood? The hotel?" "No," he said. So she told him. She watched his expression as the truth landed. This was the moment she had been quietly preparing for all week. Not for spite, but because he needed to see the complete picture. The one he had dismissed as unremarkable and insufficient. His face cycled through emotions she couldn't name as he processed, in that instant, that the woman he saw as a secondary character had been writing the entire story. "How much?" he began. "It doesn't matter," she said. "That's the point. That's what you need to understand. The number is irrelevant. What matters is that I am a whole person, with a family and a history and a life that is huge and real. And I have been hiding in the margins of that life, terrified of being seen as anything but your wife. But I am so much more than that. I always was." Finally, he asked if there was any chance at all. She genuinely considered it, giving the idea the 3 full seconds it warranted. "No," she said. "I don't think so." And what shocked her was the absence of sadness when she said it, only the feeling of truth. And so it had all begun when September arrived. Margot navigated the month with the sharp focus of a woman who had ceased wasting energy on sorrow and was channeling it into building something new. She was done with tearing things down. The demolition had already taken place in an elevator, a bathtub, and a nursery at 3 in the morning. Now was the time for construction. She began assembling her future with the same discerning care she used for collecting art, patient, with a clear vision for the long term. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed, thanks to a clean, non-negotiable prenuptial agreement. Derek's lawyer returned within the 24-hour window with 3 counteroffers. Russell dismissed each one with a politeness that clearly signaled the discussion was closed. Ultimately, Derek's settlement included his car, his personal belongings, 2 joint accounts funded by his own contributions, and a cash payment that Margot's lawyers rightfully described as generous, considering his legal standing. He signed without a fight. Margot guessed it was because, as Patrice, who always found out everything, later confirmed, he finally understood. It wasn't triumph. She had to be clear about that, at least inside her own head. This feeling wasn't victory. A marriage that worked, that would have been winning. This was simply landing on her own 2 feet. She knew not every woman in her position did. Some are lost, with nowhere to turn, no Russell Hart in their corner, no trust fund, no Connecticut house. She thought of them often now, knowing she wasn't separate from them, just luckier, with more cushion for the fall. She knew Cassandra had learned of the Ellison name from Derek, had Googled it, and seen the full picture, the Forbes features, the board seats, the foundation. She wondered how that must have felt, but didn't linger on it. It wasn't virtue that saved her. It was inheritance and luck, a difference she tried to remember as Derek's things were removed on a Wednesday. He arrived with a moving crew. She didn't peek through the blinds, but made tea and sat with a book in the art room. She listened to the sounds, drawers opening, boxes shuffling, the front door swinging open and shut, again and again, until silence fell. That night, at 2 in the morning and 33 weeks pregnant, she found herself reorganizing the closet. A single lamp cast a glow on Derek's empty side. All that space. She began to move things, deliberately, methodically. She spread her own clothes out, shifting each hanger, one by one, until his side and her side blended into one. There were no longer 2 sides to anything. For 3 years, she'd been compressed into half of her own closet. Now she expanded into the whole space, like a plant leaning toward the sun, returning to its natural size after being kept too small for far too long. Derek's mother called on a Thursday morning. Nora Reeve was 64 and had spent 30 years loving her son while seeing him for exactly who he was, an admirable feat, though she sometimes wielded that love like a weapon. Margot had steeled herself for this conversation. "Margot," Nora began, her voice that of a woman who'd rehearsed a speech but was already going off script. "I want you to know that I know what he did." "Okay," Margot said. "I'm not defending him. He's indefensible." A pause followed, the kind filled with a search for honest words. "I'm calling because I love that baby. That is my grandchild, regardless of what Derek did. I am asking you, woman to woman, please let me be part of her life." After a moment, Margot answered. "Nora," she said softly, "I was never going to keep her from you. That was never in question." A long silence. "Really?" Nora asked, her voice small. "She's going to need all the people who love her," Margot said. "I'm not subtracting anyone from that list." When Nora spoke again, the defensive edge in her voice was gone, replaced by something softer. "He didn't deserve you," she said, her voice quiet. "I know," Margot replied. "But he gave me her, so I can't be entirely sorry." In the second week of September, Cassandra did something Margot never asked for. She sent a voluntary statement to Derek's lawyer detailing the timeline of their relationship and confirming that Derek had told her his marriage was over. It wasn't legally necessary. The prenup was ironclad, but it put the truth on the record. Why would she do that? Patrice asked. Because she needed to not be complicit anymore, Margot answered slowly. Even accidentally, she needed the truth to exist somewhere outside of her own head. Do you feel bad for her? Margot thought about it. I feel adjacent to her, she finally said. Like we were trapped in the same story, and neither of us was the one writing it. I deserved better. Not because of my background or my money, but because of who I am. I deserved a partner who wanted to see all of me. The inheritance, and the woman who existed apart from it. I'll raise my daughter to understand that about herself, so she doesn't have to learn it the hard way. Late in September, at 37 weeks, Dr. Caroline Merritt slid the cold transducer over Margot's belly. Any time now, she said, looking at the screen. Margot drove home from that appointment alone. She had her people, Vivian, Patrice, even Russell, but she needed those 22 minutes with just the radio and the city streets. Stopped at a red light on Riverside, she finally named the feeling she'd been wrestling with for weeks. It wasn't anxiety or grief. It was relief. Not true happiness, not yet, but the specific relief that comes when something that was destined to break finally shatters, and you find the ground is still solid beneath your feet. The light turned green, and she drove home. Eleanor, Vivian Reeve, was born on October 1st at 4:57 in the morning, after 14 hours of what Patrice later called heroic and extremely loud labor. Both were true. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and roses, brought by Vivian from her garden. The sky outside was the deep pre-dawn dark. Vivian had been in the waiting room since midnight. Russell Hart sent 3 dozen white peonies, knowing her favorite flowers. The card read simply, "Welcome, Miss Eleanor. The board is going to love you." Derek wasn't there. It was Margot's choice, made clearly and without malice. When labor started, she had texted him, "I'm at St. Mary's. Baby is coming. I'll send pictures." He replied instantly, "Please let me come." "Not today," she'd written back. "She'll know you. She'll have you in her life. But today is mine." And he had respected it. At 4:58, Dr. Merritt placed Eleanor on Margot's chest. 8 pounds, 1 ounce, with a full head of dark hair and enormous eyes that seemed to be taking in the whole room. "Hi," Margot whispered. She had expected to feel love, but the word is an abstraction until it lands. She had expected fear, maybe even grief for the perfect family picture she once imagined. She did not expect to feel this complete, as if her entire life had been a journey to this exact moment. Not the marriage, the money, or the art, just this. Her. Right now. She held her daughter as the room buzzed around them, a world of nurses and machines. Dr. Merritt checked vitals, making notes with the quiet smile of a woman who knew that while this was her 1,000th time, for the person in the bed, it was the only time. Eventually, Vivian came in. Vivian Ellison, who never cried, stood in the doorway, looked at her daughter holding her granddaughter, and wept. The real kind of tears. The kind that had been waiting for this very moment to be released. "She looks like your father," Vivian said. "I know." "He would have—" "I know," Margot said again, and they sat with the weight and the beauty of that truth. 6 days later, Margot was home, standing at the kitchen island. The same morning light streamed through the same window, in the same kitchen where she had stood 7 weeks prior with a glass of water she never drank. Back then, she'd held a phone that wasn't hers and a future that was dismantling itself in her hands. Now she made coffee with one hand while Eleanor slept in a carrier on her chest, tiny mouth open, small fists curled by her chin. Margot remembered what she saw that day. The playlist titled Cast Summer, the text preview with 4 words, "You deserve the world." She looked down at the sleeping baby against her heart. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "More than okay. We're going to be exactly what we're supposed to be." Eleanor slept on. The coffee maker beeped. Light filled the room. She glanced at her phone just once. A text from Patrice, a missed call from Vivian, an email from Russell about fourth quarter board notes. She put the phone down and poured her coffee. He had chosen, every day, for 14 months to build this other life. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate construction of tickets, reservations, and secret texts. It was a parallel existence running right alongside hers. That Thursday evening, Derek was putting on a show, making the special effort he always did when a vague guilt was bothering her. He opened the wine without being asked, followed up on a conversation from days ago, and placed his phone screen down on the dinner table. "How are you feeling?" he asked with manufactured concern. She looked at him across the perfectly staged scene, the candlelight, the wine, the pasta. "Honestly," she said, "I feel like I'm standing at the edge of a cliff, like everything is about to change." He nodded seriously. "Third trimester jitters," he diagnosed. "Totally normal." She picked up her fork. "Yes," she said. Something like that. That was who she was, not what she owned. "I spent 3 years being Derek's wife. It was real. It was true. It was something I chose and cherished and now mourn. But underneath it all, I was always this person. I was Theo's daughter, Vivian's daughter, and Eleanor's mother. I was a woman who always knew her own worth, but sometimes let others convince her she was less. I'm finished with that part. I'm finished with the convincing." When the Forbes article went live, Derek texted. His name flashed on her screen. She took a deep breath and opened the message. "I saw the piece. I had no idea. I mean, I knew about some family money, but not this. Margot, I am so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." She read it over twice. Then she typed her reply. "Take care of yourself, Derek, and be good to her. She deserves a father she can rely on." She hit send, set her phone aside, and lifted Eleanor into her arms. That chapter was officially closed. By November, Eleanor was 6 weeks old and already had very strong opinions. That was the one thing no one had quite prepared Margot for. The opinions. In the quiet of her father's study, a room she'd avoided for so long, Margot held Eleanor against her chest. It was the one place that still smelled of him, of his books. The ghost of pipe tobacco he'd given up 2 decades ago, and the furniture polish she stubbornly refused to change. She sat in his chair, the warm weight of her sleeping daughter, an anchor. She spoke to him, her words barely a breath, meant only for the ones who are gone, but need to hear you most. "I found the wall, Dad," she whispered. "You always said there'd be a moment I'd have to choose between what's comfortable and what's true. I found it, and I'm through it, bruises and all." Eleanor let out a soft sigh, a sound of pure safety, oblivious to the weight of adult choices. "And I know what I kept from it all," Margot continued. "Not the anger, not the could-have-beens. What I kept is this. The knowledge that keeping myself small was never protection. It was just fear. And I know I'm the kind of person who lands on her feet. I'll spend my whole life making sure she knows she is too." Earlier that Thanksgiving evening, the house had been full of life, filled with new versions of old traditions. Her sister Patrice had found her, handing her a glass of wine. "You know," Patrice had said softly, "most people in your shoes are still in the ugly crying phase at 6 weeks postpartum." Margot had smiled. "Oh, I did my ugly crying. In an elevator, a bathtub, a nursery. Classic efficient Ellison. After a shared laugh, Patrice asked the real question. Are you happy? Margot considered it honestly, the way her father taught her to. I'm getting there, she admitted. It's not a straight line. From a chair by the window, Nora Reeve was singing a soft, off-key song to Eleanor. Seeing her there, Derek's mother, Eleanor's grandmother, was Margot's deliberate choice. Derek's actions were his own to account for. Nora's love for this child was real, and it belonged to Eleanor, not to Margot's grievances. That sense of clarity was why, a week later, she finally wrote the letter, not for absolution, but for recognition. Dear Cassandra, it began, we were both in the dark about different things. You about me and me about him. I hope you find someone who tells you the whole truth from the start. Someone who celebrates you genuinely. You deserve that. So did I. She mailed it and never heard back, but it didn't matter. She hadn't needed a reply. By January, when Eleanor was 3 months old, Margot was back at work, taking on a small acquisition project. She met with the family's representative, speaking with the full confidence of someone who knew her worth, a directness she'd inherited from her father, but had suppressed for years. You're very impressive, the man said as he shook her hand. Thank you, Margot replied, meaning it. Yes, I know. Driving home that January afternoon, she called Patrice. Got the acquisition, she said. I am shocked, stunned completely, Patrice deadpanned. Margot let out a real laugh, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. The winter light streamed through the windshield, so different from the harsh, overexposed gold of that one morning 7 months ago. That was the day she had stood at her kitchen island, holding a glass of water she couldn't drink, her life dismantling itself around her, piece of bump pints. It was the day she had found it, the thing that had been hidden from her, the thing Cassandra had also been in the dark about. She'd seen the email, a confirmation for a private jewelry consultation. It wasn't the purchase that broke her. It was the inscription he'd requested for a bracelet she would never see. The words were meant for someone else, a secret celebration of a life she had no part in. My beautiful Cassandra, it read, for our new beginning. And just like that, the comfortable life she thought she was building became a lie. The future she believed in, the version of the man she loved, it all evaporated in the glare of a single screen. That was the wall, the choice between the comfortable lie and the devastating truth. It was terrible, and it was also done. The prison door had been unlocked the entire time. She had just been too busy keeping herself small to notice it was open. Now, this new life was hers. A life with a daughter who, at only 6 weeks old, was already entirely herself. A baby with strong opinions about the angle of the light, the warmth of her bath, and the specific song her mother hummed while pacing the kitchen at 2 in the morning. Watching her daughter discover her own will was the most extraordinary thing Margot had ever witnessed, more stunning than any piece of art she had ever acquired, more valuable than anything sold at auction. This was why she had decided to come back to the Connecticut house for Thanksgiving, the house she had avoided since her father's death. Not to renovate or erase, but to live in it again, to fill it with new things. Vivian, her mother, was already there, happily reorganizing the kitchen. Patrice and her family had explored every corner, filling the quiet rooms with noise and laughter. Even her brother Russell had made a classic appearance, holding Eleanor for exactly 11 minutes, while having what looked like a serious conversation with her before leaving just before dessert. It was a house full of people who saw her, fully and completely, and in the center of it all was Eleanor, being held and loved. This was what she had kept. Not the anger, not the grievances, but this. The knowledge that she could be truly seen, and that she would land on her feet. As she watched Nora sing to her granddaughter, Margot knew she had made the right choice. She had come through the fire, and on the other side, she had found not what she'd lost, but everything she was meant to have. With her keys on the hall table, Margot moved toward the sound of the voices, toward her life. She could already make out Vivian's distinct tone from the nursery, the one reserved for books she deemed worthy, a seriousness that made it completely sincere. And then there was Eleanor's soft hum, the one she made when she was truly listening. Eleanor Reeve would grow up certain she was cherished. She would know her own name and its power. Her home would have pale green bathroom tiles, a small diamond corn piece in the art room, and a grandmother who believed books deserved respect. Most of all, she would grow up knowing her mother had made a choice. It all came down to that choice. Just moments before, sitting in the driveway, she had watched the season's light stretch across the yard, cool and confident. She took a breath, a simple pause between one part of her day and the next. This wasn't the frozen paralysis of August, the feeling of a woman trapped outside her own life. This was the quiet beat before walking through the door you built yourself. She had let someone else's small-minded view of her become her own limit. But she was done with that ceiling. She was the full picture now. The art and the money, the trust and the grief, the mother and the daughter. She was the woman who drove 40 minutes for the perfect shade of green tile because she knew her own mind. She thought of that woman 7 months ago standing barefoot at the kitchen island with a glass of water and a playlist humming. A woman with 4 words on a screen and a secret vast enough to swallow the world. That was the moment. The choice was her. The content in this story was meticulously researched, constructed, and edited by our team, developed with purpose, and crafted with care to offer you meaning, emotional depth, and a lesson that stays with you. We appreciate you being here. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.